I'm going to demonstrate something called an infinite loop, and I'm going to use one of the while loops that I just created in order to do that. So here my count is 1, okay. I'm just going to output while loop, and then here if the count's less than or equal to 5, it'll see out loop, right? It'll increment the counter. So we've seen how this works. Let me just run the program. And it displays loop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, one of the most common mistakes that beginning programmers make is creating what's called an infinite loop. Now, the curly braces that you see right here are optional in while loops. So if you don't put them in, the next one statement is the body of the while loop, meaning it's almost like doing this. Okay? If you don't put them in, the next one statement is the body of the loop. Well, what happens here is the count is 1, that's less than or equal to 5, it'll output, it's still 1, it'll output, it's still 1, etc., etc. So I'm just going to take this out because this is the most common way to create an infinite loop. And let's see what happens. Okay? Now, it's really infinitely displaying loop 1, right? You just can't see that it's doing it so fast. All right, that's an infinite loop. So we can fix this infinite loop by putting our curly braces back in. If you get a bunch of things flying out to the screen, you probably have an infinite loop. Another cause of infinite loops is by accidentally putting a semicolon here. And what this does is while the count is less than or equal to 5, it'll execute the semicolon. It sees that as the body of the loop. So let me just show you what happens if you accidentally put a semicolon there. Now this is also an infinite loop, but the infinite loop, it's just infinitely executing semicolons. So you can see the cursor's just flashing here. It never gets to the cout statement. So if you see something like that with a cursor flashing, you might also have an infinite loop. When you're working with loops, you have to be very careful of the syntax. You'll almost always have the curly braces. I would recommend putting it in just in case. The only time you might not need them, and here's just one example, okay, is if I was to do something like this, because I'm outputting and I'm incrementing the loop counter in the same statement. So in that case, the body of the loop is just one statement, and you can see what happens. And some programmers might like that syntax. They might use that, so you have to kind of understand it. But I think for beginning programmers, it's probably easier to use the curly braces to denote the body of the loop. Try not to get too fancy with where you increment things. And remember, don't ever put a semicolon out here. That causes big problems.